So I have to translate this article from Haaretz to you about the visit of Ta-Nehisi Coates in Ramallah. And I love the way there's a sentence there. It's very simple. It is kibush. What is kibush in English? Should have looked it up before. It is occupation. Occupation. So very interesting how a man comes from the United States, who's the whole country is occupied, isn't it? Isn't it so? I mean, does he ever write about the plight of does it matter to him that he lives on land occupied by white colonial forces from Holland, England, Spain, France, that completely took over the land of the Native Americans? No. And that's the problem I have, the first one. But then there's more problems. He visited, there was a Palestinian literature festival. That should have been a small festival. And you know what the sad thing is? That he's like, he says he follows what happens in Palestine and it's not complicated. It's not complicated. It's very simple. It's occupation. Well. And the visit hasn't been, nobody talked about it in the Palestinian or Israeli media. Maybe it's because it's not that interesting. African American, though, it's quite unique the way, unique and not unique, because we have other African American writers that have also supported the Palestinians, identifying with them. Had they been a bit more, and there's like he actually he says it's very simple. The fact that he says that the Middle East conflict is very simple shows you how much he knows about the Middle East conflict. And then he participated in a panel with a British Palestinian writer, Isabella Hamad. Have you read any of her books? And the political activist Mohammed El-Kurd, who is part of the Sheikh Jarrah Jerusalem conflict, where they took a neighborhood that was Jewish, occupied it, Jordan occupied East Jerusalem, and then they claimed it to be Palestinian and changed the name. So that's one conflict. The festival this year came under the Palestine and the Global South, trying to connect the Palestinian conflict or struggle to other struggles around the world and decolonization. Coates started the panel comparing the conflict of the black population in the U.S. to that of the Palestinians, who are fighting for their right for freedom. Very interesting. These are the kind of people that say that Jesus was Palestinian and completely erased his Jewish connection. It's very interesting that he forgets so many things. For instance, the fact that the African Americans who are struggling for their freedom compared themselves to the children of Israel, leaving Egypt. And Martin Luther King, who was probably the greatest leader of the modern emancipation of the African Americans, was a Zionist, and 100% Zionist. And not to mention the Jewish politicians, amongst them a relative of mine, who walked with Martin Luther King, not to mention Jewish freedom fighters for the African Americans, who not only marched along with Martin Luther King, but also volunteered to help desegregate the South. Amongst them, there were Jews that were murdered by the KKK. And let's not forget, Jews are also on the list of the horrible organization, the Ku Klux Klan, that also targets Africans. So it's quite interesting how he completely identifies the Africans and Palestinians. Let's not forget, of course, that the Arabs were the slave. They were the ones that were slave merchants, and they were in Africa. No, let's not forget the Muslims who took over Africa, certain parts of Africa, and forced Islam on the Africans. That's occupation. Christianity did the same, but Christianity actually also established schools and helped Africans become part of the world by speaking English or French. So actually the colonization of Africa was also promoted their ability to be part of the world by learning the cultures that dominate the world. Not that it's obviously all colonization is negative. And then he talked about the power struggles between black and white in U.S. and difficulties. Well, it's also difficult. He says, do you think that people are afraid to go in the street because they're black? Well, people are afraid to go in the streets because they're Jewish. And, as for the Palestinians, they're the majority. The Arabs are the majority here. So it's kind of interesting that he doesn't know anything about history of the Middle East. And he comes there and he published, he's active in the Atlantic, which is a very prestigious literature magazine. In 2014, The Case of Reparations. And he talks about the discrimination against blacks in America. And he says that they should pay them compensation. And he talks about the compensation of Holocaust survivors by Germany. In Ramallah, he was asked why he didn't talk about the Israeli occupation and the Palestinians in the article. He says that he he was limited in his ability to put all these things in context, but it's really weird that, he wants that white America will pay for the slaves. I mean, isn't America paying already by the fact that they allow there's special places at the university, that there is, if you're African American, you have also, it's like being an Arab in Israel, you also get benefits. It's easier for them to get accepted to universities and so forth. There are a lot of also positive things to being a minority in America. So there's scholarships, there's all kinds of benefits. I'm not getting into it. So he talks about, he thinks that I think the idea that you have to know the facts because you talk is not correct. I think that's where he's wrong. I mean, he's obviously very ignorant about the Middle East. He grew up in Baltimore. His father was part of the Black Panther movement, and he studied English literature at Harvard University in Washington, which is a black university. Then he worked as a journalist in very prestigious media outlets: Time, Village Voice, Philadelphia Weekly, and from all of them he was thrown out of them. Obviously, he's either too rebellious or he's not good enough. I don't know. 2008, or maybe he's just says things without checking the facts, which is what I suspect. Then he wrote a very controversial article, This is How We Lost to the White Man, in Atlantic magazine, when he criticized Bill Cosby and his conservative approach. That's before he had his cases with his sexual problems. And then he became an editor in that. They made him editor of the Atlantic. He's also writing in the New York Times, Washington Post. 2015, his book Between the World and Myself, I guess. I don't know what is the translation in English. Ben Olam Leveni. And he was like candidate for Pulitzer. And yeah, he's quite a prolific writer. But it's so sad that he chooses a side. And he's so sad that, yeah, black and white kind of vision. Palestinians are the good and the Israeli Jews are the bad. And also it's really sad that he doesn't realize as a writer. I mean, if he studied English literature at the university, surely he didn't skip over the long list of Jewish American writers, but sadly there's hardly any Muslim, Arab American writer. Why is that? He never asked himself. And how many prominent Palestinian writers do we know? I don't know any. I really want to read some, but I don't know. And the writers that I know that write about the Palestinian problems are Israeli. People like David Grossman and Amos Oz, of course, talk about the problem of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the violence that of course affects us. But the fact that he identifies more with the Palestinians than the Jews is kind of funny, because the African American movement, civil rights movement, was definitely identifying themselves with the children of Israel. It's not about sides, it's about stopping the violence, I think. But as long as people demonize Israel and call us occupying force, I think you're really doing a great misjustice to Israel, because after all, Israel is a society that offers so much more freedom than Palestinian society ever will, in every, whether it's LGBT, whether it's free speech, anything. I mean, it's really odd that there was even a conference of literature there, because as far as I know, you can be in jail for several years just from posting something on Facebook, not to mention writing. So maybe if you're a British Palestinian or American Palestinian, you can get away with it. But if you're a Palestinian, first of all, you don't have freedom of speech. And it's very odd how it's easy to point the finger at Israel and how all of a sudden we're white. Whereas according to the Ku Klux Klan and every neo-Nazi movement in America, the Jews are the same as Africans, and the Arabs, by the way. So I think it's quite preposterous how African American writers so ungrateful for the Jewish people who helped so much with desegregation. And Martin Luther King is like completely, he forgets him. And maybe he finds other more radical people that have to do with Islam, like the Nation of Islam, a very racist organization. So the radical movement of the African Americans didn't do much good for the African Americans, because they just scared people away from them, and they're a very important cause. And I think they definitely do have a problem. But if you walk in Tel Aviv and you see them working here, and I'm talking about in building sites, not just as simple labor, but they actually run the whole show. They are in charge of building sites worth millions of dollars. They have great jobs. I can only dream of jobs like them. I mean, it's not my field, but they are working a lot in construction, in running the construction, and planning, and they are part of our medical field, whether in hospitals, whether pharmacy, and the various departments. The Arabs are quite part of the Israeli society, with nothing at all like the way the Africans are being openly discriminated against by the police and whatever. So maybe, we definitely have a long way to go, because there is discrimination, obviously. On one hand, on the other hand, not as much as there is against African Americans in America. Can't even compare it. And it's weird that he's willing to come to a society that is so violent, where terror is okay, where violence is okay, and where free speech is not allowed. It's very odd for me. And it's weird that he doesn't even check his facts, which is why probably he was fired from most of the jobs he had working on newspapers. I'm not really happy to see that kind of article.